Dalam kegalauan kini, persoalan yang harus dibangkit ialah jumlah yang hidup merempat dan melarat. Apakah dana itu disalurkan secara telus bagi mengelak ketirisan dan pembaziran? Kedua, kepantasan berdasarkan kefahaman. Apakah mungkin berlaku tindakan yang pantas, bijak dan berhemah dalam mengatur dan menyusun serta menetapkan kerangka belanjawan negara? Justru perbentangan belanjawan 2023 yang saya namakan belanjawan madani ialah cerminan prinsip bertanggungjawab dan sistem nilai yang luhur yang mampu mendepani tantangan semasa, termasuk tantangan ekonomi global yang syarat dengan tidak ketentuan. Setelah mendengar keluhan rakyat dan gagasan dan gesaan rakan-rakan Yang Berhormat di Dewan Yang Mulia ini, saya memilih untuk menghidang belanjawan dengan memaparkan fakta dan angka sebenar dan tidak cuba menggabui minda rakyat dengan data memukau.
Hi everyone, hello and welcome to this new episode of NST Insight. My name is Amalina Kamal. I'm an Assistant News Editor for the NST Online Desk, and I'm joined by my colleague.
Hi, I'm Azanis Shahila. I'm a reporter for Business Time.
So earlier, right, what you guys just watched is Prime Minister cum Finance Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim himself presenting the Budget 2023 under the Unity Government. So fun fact is that this particular budget is for Anwar himself. It's presented after a lapse of 25 years. So that's a long time since he was the last finance minister.
So just a summary about this 2023 budget. We have seen that this new 2023 budget is revised upward to 388.1 billion. So it making this budget the largest allocation in Malaysian history. We've also seen several new tax enforcement and new tax incentive, subsidy and more allocation for the rakyat.
Yeah, so new tax enforcement, new incentives. I suppose we can go into deeper, but for our audience, we would like to introduce our panelists first. To my right, I have Harvindar Singh, who is a tax specialist.
Hi, Mr. Harvindar.
Hi, thank you very much. It's
And we
great to be
also
here.
have Samirul Othman, who is the Political, Economic and International Relations Analyst.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for inviting me.
No
How are you
problem.
doing, Mr.
Fine, thank you.
Right. Before we go into our question rounds, right, I would like to ask maybe Harvindar first. Did you catch the budget earlier?
Oh yes, I managed to catch the budget.
What did you make of it?
Oh well, it is, as you mentioned, it's definitely by a mile an expansionary budget, and there's a huge allocation of funds. It is a budget which basically is targeting towards the assisting taxpayers, the rakyat, with the rising cost of living, and it is as expected as well. We've not really seen any major introductions of new taxes. There's this idea of introducing capital gains tax, which is probably something that needs to be thought out carefully. I've got some reservations about the introduction of capital gains tax. So that's basically what I feel. It is a budget which is well thought out. I believe a lot of it has been well planned. So we will go into the details.
Right.
In the
Well
later part
thought
of the
out,
discussion.
well planned budget. That's for
Yes.
you.
Yeah.
But Samirul, for you yourself.
How
Yes.
about you?
Yeah, I want to go into the understanding, of this whole thing. Prime Minister comes up with the concept of Madani. So actually, if you read his book in '97, Asian Renaissance, there was a chapter on humanistic economics. And then of late, people have been talking about Madani. So some people trace it to John Locke. John Locke is the father of liberalism, one of the founding fathers, and his philosophy influenced the United States. Yeah, and other people related to Ibn Khaldun, civil society, and yeah, in contemporary times there is another political figure in Tunisia, Rashid Ghannouchi. He is a Muslim Democrat, you can say, and he's also talking about Madani. You can research on ResearchGate. And the book by John Locke is also available, I think on Shopee or whatever. Yeah, so basically, you know, in the past, in universities in Europe, they used to teach PPE. You had to know philosophy, politics, and economics. Everyone wanted a good life, including Karl Marx. The only difference is how are they going to achieve that good life. So economics was the last thing, and it was about counting numbers and all that. But somehow, over the past 100 years or so, this thing has dominated. We are all interested in numbers. In the US, it's got separated from the philosophical part and political, but they still have PPE in Oxford and Cambridge. But so I just want to tell you, and our Prime Minister is probably reviving this tradition. It's nothing new. I said it's been around hundreds of years, and even Adam Smith discussed it. And actually, Adam Smith was also influenced by Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was also talking about division of labor and business cycle theory. I just stopped there. This is the introduction. The philosophical, we all want a good life, that's it.
Yeah. We all want it.
Yeah. It's how you set to achieve it, yeah. Sorry.
Right. I mean, interesting history lesson at least, right, for our audience as well. I mean, I love that. Right? So I suppose we can straight go into the question rounds, right? So for the first question, Budget 2023 is revised upwards to 388.1 billion as the government continues to provide support to steer the economy. Do you think the new budget is expansionary?
Yes, well, it is certainly expansionary. An expansionary budget is one where there's greater spending by the government. There's the measures such as tax cuts that are introduced, and we've seen that there's been a reduction of the personal tax rate for the the band of taxpayers that have got chargeable income of between 35,000 to 100,000. And then there is also a reduction in the corporate tax rate for SMEs. These were measures that I think have been followed through from the previous announcement in the budget that was announced in October. There has been, of course, a greater allocation of funds, and there is the budget is the funds that have been allocated to SMEs, for example. I think it's a lot more than what it has been allocated in the past. The SMEs essentially form about 95% of the business community in the country, business organizations, and they employ about 70% of the workforce. Right? So funds allocations, like even to the extent of looking at assisting with the repair and setting up of stalls, 50 million is allocated for that, for the micro or the small traders, the petty traders. You've got an amount of 750 million, which is put under this initiative, pendapatan something for the rakyat, which is to be channeled through various organizations for the purposes of being used for to enhance the opportunities for the rakyat to generate additional income.
It's basically inviting them to help the
Correct.
economy as well.
That's right.
Samirul, what about you?
Okay, so when you say expansionary, what do you mean, yeah?
I mean,
okay, no, I'm so basically,
what's your definition?
Yeah,
what's your idea of
so
it? I suppose?
basically, the government is spending more than it can earn in revenue, yeah? That's what it means, yeah?
Sure.
Okay, so basically the government collects just enough revenue to finance its operating expenditure, just a bit more usually.
Sure.
And so it has been borrowing for development expenditure. And this has been happening since the Asian financial crisis. It's about 24 years or something like that, you can see. So all this while, we have been running a deficit for the development expenditure. They borrow for the development operating expenditure. But not to worry, because every year IMF will come. It's called Article 4 Consultation, International Monetary Fund, for its member states. And they will be releasing their report soon. It's usually around March or April, and it will coincide with Bank Negara's annual report. Annual report, Bank Negara will tell what happened last year. And usually the Ministry of Finance report in October will project. So anyway, but an Article 4 IMF consultation, they will see. Now our balance of payment, current account is surplus. So it's okay. So many countries like that, we can pay for our debt, yeah. But if our current account were negative and we are running a deficit, it will be a red flag. Then we have twin deficits. But so far that has never happened. So the IMF will allow it and we can pay off our debts. Now, what we do with our debt and all of that is a different story. Yeah? So that's how we have been financing, and that's how we got the 1.5 trillion. So about 1 trillion is government debt. The remaining is loans guaranteed by the contingent liabilities, and also all those partnerships the government get into with the private sector for development. All and good if that is what is done. If something else turns out, God bless us. So actually over the past 4 or 5 years, in 2017 the government debt was 680 billion. So now it's close to 1 trillion plus. But most of it is local, 97%, and it's in ringgit. And we probably spend every year around 45 billion just to service the loan, the loan taken. But the problem will come if one day people are not interested in ringgit debt and they want in US dollar, and then we will be in big trouble.
But is that not the case? I mean, in the current situation, you
know? No. In Malaysia, it has not yet happened. But I'll give you an example. In Malaysia, 1/3, I think, of the loan is in US dollar, and that will be a problem. So of course the government can keep on increasing the debt. They can keep on, as long as people are interested to buy our debt instrument in ringgit. So this is what I want. The contingent liability is basically, see, for example, Felda or whatever, they take a loan, they can't pay, and the government will have to pay. That's what you mean. It's not yet a debt. It's a liability. And I think you can give a better.
I feel like you have something to follow up with whatever Samirul just said.
So that's what I want to relate. So this thing about running a debt has been going on for a long time. But it was interesting, during Anwar's time, he also ran a budget surplus. But I want to say more about the economic situation then and now and why it is different. But probably I'll talk about that after this.
Okay, an exclusive one for us, I suppose. Yeah, Harvindar, you look as though you wanted to chime in earlier.
No, well, I think as what Samirul has said, for a long time now we've had a deficit budget. And for this year, like what we were discussing earlier, the revenue levels are actually going lower compared to what it was last year. Is at about 291.4 billion or something. And last year is about 294. And then we're talking about deficit in the budget as well. So how is that going to be achieved? It's an interesting proposition, situation, but I believe the government, and some of these measures have been sort of introduced in this budget as well. When it comes to, for example, how is the additional revenue going to be generated? We have, from the tax authority's perspective, there is a voluntary disclosure scheme that is being reintroduced, which is starting from 1st June of this year until December of next year. And under this voluntary disclosure scheme, which is meant for both income taxes and indirect taxes, for income taxes at least, they talk about 100%, the penalty is reduced. Right, there's 100% reduction of penalty.
Okay.
So I believe we are talking about a deficit budget at this point in time. We're talking about revenues being lower than last year, whereas the expenditure is going higher. There are measures that are being introduced, and tax is actually the highest contributor to the revenue by collection by the government. There are many measures that I feel will help to manage that. We can discuss a little bit more of that as we go along.
We have one question that is specifically more about the nature of the budget. Anis, maybe you want to present that to our guests?
So I will touch about the deficit. We have seen that the budget allocation is high, but then the deficit is low. So what will be your take on this? How the government will achieve this target?
Yeah, it's. I haven't seen the details. They say the devil is in the details. But at this point, I also want to add what my panelist said, my fellow panelist. So he said that, actually our tax to GDP ratio is quite low. It's approaching 11%, and not many people can afford to pay income tax. We have a low we have a low amount of, not many people can afford to pay. But also, aside from that, we can also look at non-tax revenue for the government.
Okay.
And non-tax revenue for the government is probably around 27% and all that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But the interesting thing is that when Anwar was Prime Minister, when Anwar was Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister in the 90s, it was a different world back then.
Yeah,
China
exactly.
had not joined the WTO, and India had not opened up. Now, China joining the WTO and India opening up, so you have 2 billion more people. So the bamboo curtain unravel and the iron curtain in Europe ravel. So we have a lot of, it's a different world. Those days we can achieve very high growth. But now, aside from the external environment we have, the structure of our economy has changed too. When the economic structure changes, the rate of growth will also slow down. You know, they have done studies in Korea and all that. When it reaches a certain stage, so the only way to go forward is to change the structure of the economy, and so that's where the IR 4.0, the green economy, and all that comes in, because you see, when the economy reaches a certain stage, it will start to plateau, and if there's no technological rejuvenation, you'll be stuck in a rut.
Okay.
And that is the challenge. I'll stop there.
Right. But I do have a follow-up to that, I suppose, or an expansion to that. Okay. So MOF said a more effective and targeted subsidy mechanism will be rolled out on selected essential goods and services. Right. Maybe Harvinder, what do you think about this targeted subsidy? What would be the best way?
What would be the best way to implement
something like this?
I think we've seen at a glance of the budget speech, of course, and listening to it as attentively as possible under the circumstances. There are measures like, for example, there's this project Rahma, I think, where they talk about the cost of goods at 5 ringgit shall be made available to relevant parties that go to certain, obviously, facilities for that. I talked about the discounted price of goods, basic goods, by 30%, where the funds have been allocated by the government to the relevant ministries and agencies to channel and to manage that. So targeted subsidies, perhaps that's one of the approach that's being taken. Rather than giving cash handouts, it shall be more, perhaps more responsibly, and the accountability-wise, there's the agency, the ministry, and the relevant authorities that would need to be accountable for that.
Do you think this targeted subsidy is really effective? How actually the government can implement this? For example, like oil subsidy, how
Well, it's difficult. If you talk about oil subsidy, how do you manage? How do you ascertain that it's only the needy are the ones that actually get it? So there are challenges with that, right? But certain other products and services perhaps are a little bit easier to manage. So
a good question. Targeted subsidy. Okay, so subsidy is about 80 billion, and about half of it is to fuel. I don't know what will happen. You see, if you remove the fuel subsidies, the fuel will go up, prices will go up by 50%.
Correct.
Okay.
And when fuel prices go up, it's transport costs, right?
Yeah.
So what you have is forward transmission, and you're going to have 2 or 3 rounds of price hikes. So I don't know how on earth are you going to do this. Easier said than done. Oh, how are you going to monitor who takes how much petrol? They did a pilot.
Some said by IC and everything.
And then that will be another cost of a few 100 million just to do that.
Actually, Samirul, if I may just add on, there was a lot of talk about the carbon tax, right? And that is an area that has not been covered in the budget. But primarily,
been talked about.
Primarily, but it's been talked about, it's been discussed, primarily because of exactly what you said, because the carbon tax would basically be imposed on the fuel suppliers, and they will then pass the cost on when they are providing that whatever electricity and gasoline and products and all. So the cost of those products will go up. The whole idea of carbon tax is to basically provide an incentive for consumers and producers to shift to green, to renewable sources of energy, etc. So, which is why we've not really seen it this time around because it's going to simply mean additional cost to
Yeah.
business. But carbon tax as a measure in the future, once things are better, it is something that would be able to provide additional revenue.
Does
back
that
to the
mean
government.
that this budget is not necessarily long-term, I suppose?
You could say that. I guess you could say that. There are incentives, of course, for the use of green technology equipment. There has been an extension of the period of application of enjoying the tax incentive of green investment tax allowance and green income tax exemption.
Yeah, but it's not like end to end. It
Yes,
stops
yes.
at somewhere.
It has got conditions and it's got certain restrictions and constraints. So it's not to say that there isn't anything in the budget that tries to deal with that, but it's not a new tax. It's not something that is all inclusive.
Well, to add a bit more, yeah. So they did some kind of study for the fuel pumps in Klang Valley. They stopped, and they also had something for electricity, but they charge more for the commercial use, not much for the domestic use. But then that's also a few billion. The other thing is that if you really scrap all of this, then you might as well come up with universal basic income and universal basic subsidies. That means everyone in this country should get 2,208 ringgit at least, because that's the minimum. That's the poverty line income. But that's another thing. If you cut down the 40 billion, then you give back. But then you also have inflation. So it's a never. There are some countries in the world which have experimented with this universal basic income.
Right. Before Anis goes into her question, I have one question with regards to tax as well. I think this is the most interesting one so far. So the government plans to introduce new taxes on luxury goods, right? Capital gains and tobacco. Do you see this new tax enforcement will help increase the country's base revenue?
I think if you talk about, firstly, let me address capital gains tax. There was some suggestion in the past about introducing this, but the fact is currently, for example, the type of capital gains tax that we have in the country is related to real property, disposal of real property or real property company shares. The contribution of RPGT to the overall tax revenue to the government is very minimal. Right? If I recall, it's probably 1 to 2%. So capital gains tax, I do not think is going to be a major contributor. But with the introduction of capital gains tax, there is always this fear that investors will start looking at our neighboring countries, Singapore, etc. The last time there was this suggestion, some IPOs that were supposed to have been carried out in Malaysia, they were put on hold because they were not sure how this will affect the sentiments of the investors. So CGT, I don't think is going to be a major contributor.
Right.
It's a question of how it's tweaked, perhaps. Taxes on luxury goods. In the past, there was this discussion about low-value goods, right? Tax on low-value goods, and in line with the aspiration of the government to basically, not increase the cost of living for the rakyat. That is, I think, thankfully not been introduced. But we've got a tax on luxury goods. It perhaps will contribute, but the amount I can't really say. For the low-value goods, I think there was an estimate of about 200 million to 300 million per annum. Whether, I suppose you could say that it should be a little bit higher on high-value goods, a little bit or a lot more higher.
Anis, I think you have some follow-up to that as well,
So
right?
Sure.
what do you think, what kind of tax will be introduced in the future? I think. besides
Well,
this?
I think for now we are looking at status quo.
Okay.
But there is always this discussion about ESG and sustainability and environmental pollution and global warming and all that. So it is, I think, probably a need for us to introduce a carbon tax or something along those lines at some point in time. But that is something that would really depend on the economic sustainability and the economic situation that the country is facing as well, I believe.
I mean, moving away from tax for a bit, there's also talks that this particular budget is an election budget.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you're a tax specialist and you're a like international political analyst, right? But
so it should be a question that
is that too generic for you?
no, it's okay. No,
okay. Samirul, maybe you wanna answer that question?
Yeah, I just wanted to continue about the tax. Actually, there's an understanding globally that you can't tax lower than 15%.
Okay.
Yeah.
The global minimum tax.
Yeah, global minimum. That's right. And Ireland got into trouble because of this, among other things.
Sure.
So you can't play around with that. The other thing,
the global minimum tax is basically an initiative. Initiative to what do you call it? On a global basis, to avoid leakage of tax, right? To avoid what we call tax evasion exercises by various parties. So in Malaysia, our tax rate is at 24%. How it's going to be implemented? In any way, there was no real, discussion on this at this point in time. But it is the whole idea is, if, for example, if a Malaysian company has a subsidiary overseas, and that subsidiary is in a tax haven and doesn't pay any tax, and has zero tax, the rate of tax in the country is 0%, then either that country shall be a signatory to what they call this inclusive framework, where the OECD and the G20 is the initiative, the G20 countries. If you are signatory to that, then that tax haven can charge that 15% global tax. If they are not a signatory, then the Malaysian holding company will have to top up a tax, pay a tax in Malaysia. So it's actually in the interest of those tax havens to be a signatory and collect the taxes. The whole idea is on a global basis to essentially try to eradicate this practice of using tax havens to shift your profits from a high tax jurisdiction to a low tax jurisdiction. So it is not exactly a new tax. It is a new tax in a country that is not essentially having it at present, but certainly Malaysia has to come up with the implementation of this at some point in time as well.
Right.
So back to the question.
If you mention whether it is
some would say that this is an election budget.
Well, because they didn't introduce GST, right? So that's one thing. True. And then when you mention about luxury goods and all that, in my mind, you might as well have a tiered GST system. You have a 1, 2 tier or 3 tier system, and then also capital gains. And I was thinking, I'm happy they didn't introduce this online tax. If you purchase anything below 500 ringgit,
don't give them ideas.
No, they interviewed me last year, and I said no, because
that's the low value tax.
Low volume tax. Yeah. You know what they should be looking at is at the stock market. You see, like about 100,000 individuals, something. They have about 200 billion, and these people, their holdings are even more than that of PNB and all that. And most of them are T20 people basically. So basically, they don't get taxed on the dividends because you can't tax twice, right? And so they don't pay any tax actually, capital gains and all that. But I don't think the government will dare to do anything there. But at the same time, they haven't introduced other taxes which might be difficult for the low income earners, especially I mentioned online tax and all that. So you can say in that way, and no GST and all that, subsidies still stay.
So you would agree to that?
Yeah. Because they have to pacify.
But can I go back to one small point that
sure.
made earlier on saying that many people can't afford to pay tax, and that's why our percentage of tax to the GDP is about 11%, 12% or so. Actually, it has been the desire, I would say, of the tax authorities to raise it to 15%, because if you are talking about most of the OECD countries, the developed countries, it's about 15%.
What's the highest, I suppose?
15% of the GDP is more or less sort of the target to be achieved. So currently we're at about 11, 12 or so.
Realistically, for us to reach that?
Yeah, I think the reason why we are not there is partly because of the compliance levels, right, of submission of tax returns and so on, and those sort of things. So to achieve that, there have been some measures that have already been introduced. Right, we have the tin the tax identification number, which was spoken about in the previous budget, the two budgets ago, and then in the last budget they talked about it again. And the tax authorities have already started issuing the TIN numbers, right, to taxpayers. The idea is to widen the tax base. Then you talk about e-invoicing, where any income, any billings, any revenues that you earn, they would be linked to the e-billing system with relevant authorities. So the possibility of tax leakages, the possibility of evasion would be managed, I think, a lot better. So I was saying earlier that at the moment we are talking about a deficit budget. We're talking about the revenue being lower than last year, and how are we going to manage this? I think, coupled with what I mentioned earlier, the voluntary disclosure of tax, which I think will generate quite a bit of revenue for the government. But on this point of voluntary disclosure, I think the tax authorities need to make it very clear, right? In what circumstances a taxpayer that has come forward and volunteered to, disclose what may not have been disclosed in the past.
Right.
Under what circumstances will he or she be reviewed again in future?
Yeah.
Because the promise is typically you come forward, then it's closed. But if in future it's reopened due to certain reasons,
Right.
then that the whole idea of doing this, the integrity behind it, is sort of it is not really there.
Sorry to interrupt for a bit, but I was just scrolling through our social media and we've already gotten some reactions.
Oh, okay.
Basically, earlier we sent out just a very generic question to our audience, like, what do you think of the budget allocation? And so basically that's the question. So one of our user by the name Sam Davis, he reacted that empty houses and condominiums which people bought and leave without use should be taxable. Expensive, it's similarly like expensive cars and watches. What do you think about that? I mean, we have seen KL with a lot of empty units, right? But some of them are actually occupied. I mean, they're with owners. Some of them are probably still, left unsold. I suppose Harvinder, as a tax specialist, is that possible?
So the question is that should you be paying taxes on what?
On not using the assets that you bought, leaving it empty.
Oh, okay. No, actually, it's something that could be looked at because at one point in time, as I recall it, there was a tax in respect of private residence that you're not occupying, where you may pay tax. I can't remember now because it's been, the exact formula, but it has been there in the past, where it becomes part of a taxable income. If you have a residential property that you're not occupying, you're not renting it out, you're not earning rental income, therefore you're not paying tax, based on the rentable value or rateable value or some value of the property, there is a formula to determine how much tax you should pay. So this is not something new. Actually, it has existed in the past. It expired a long time ago.
There's also another right. There's also another question that we threw out, especially in particular about the luxury good taxes, whether or not it will affect consumer trends. And looking at our Instagram, actually, a lot of them say that it will affect consumer trends, but it's just very generic in that sense. So will tax on luxury goods have an impact on tourism as well? How do you think it will make Malaysia attractive to foreigners, at least? I don't know, like even locals,
I haven't seen the details yet, right?
Well, if foreigners are coming to Malaysia and they're purchasing luxury goods over here, and they have to pay tax on that, it's going to be a higher cost to them. Currently, I would think that it will have some impact, but I don't think it's going to be really a major issue.
Samirul, you look like, are you a shopper? You're just like confused there.
No, I haven't figured out, but basically it goes back to how the government generates revenue.
It's going to tax on that.
70% is probably from taxes, another 27% is non-tax revenue. And that's why you have Petronas and you have excise and all of that, So fortunately we have that to help us out. So all these things, I don't know, as you say, the devil is in the details. So I really don't know how, And actually they left out one tax too, death tax. That was stopped in 1990. But my fear is if you have that kind of tax, there's a lot of people will be migrating. Many rich Malaysians will probably be migrating to countries where you don't have this kind of tax.
Sure.
So this kind of tax, I think you have in Japan and in France maybe. But it's a different structure of society.
I mean, is it even attractive in Japan and France? Like, what's the performance for that?
You see, Japan is a very socialist country, you can see. With this kind of tax, probably in 3 generations, you can't, you can't inherit much. And it has a great equalizing effect. And it's a homogeneous society. And something about the French too. I don't think, I don't know how it will be done here, but in other countries like Australia, they don't have this kind of tax. I don't think Canada has it too. So it seems to work in certain countries with certain traits. And they have these socialist tendencies and all that. France too, Japan too.
But are you saying that even Malaysia has that tendency?
No, no, I don't think so. We don't have that tendency.
Okay.
So it's not so easy to do. When you mention about all this tax, that's why I'm trying to figure out how it will work, yeah. But it goes back to that, government has to collect revenue. Now, you see, out of the 15 million plus of Malaysians who work, I think only 2.5 million can afford to pay income tax. So what we should be doing is we should be increasing the incomes of Malaysians.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
And that will actually solve the problem of cost of living.
Yes.
Actually, if you study, the rate at which our pay grew is less than the rate at which our GDP grew.
Yes.
And not only that, it's also less than the rate of which prices increases.
I mean, how much do you
stagnation is
think
terrible.
Okay, yeah.
the rate should be?
Oh, okay, very good question. Okay, right now, for every ringgit of profit that is made, 35 cents go back to the workers, 65% go to the employers. Now, in developed countries, it's probably close to 50-50, South Korea and Japan, and all that, Singapore. Now, out of that 35%, 17% goes to B40, 38% goes to M40, and 45% goes to T20. So you can see B40 and M40 don't get much. So actually, this B40 and M40, it's no big deal. If you do a graph and you want to assign this portion is 40%, this portion is 50%, this portion is 50%. But if you look at the decent living wages, by Bank Negara, and based on pre-COVID levels and post, I don't want to go. I can say that B40 don't make it, and most of M40 won't make it either. Probably half of it. So we should just have B60 or B70, and that's more realistic. And so this is all labeling. Yeah. So I'll stop there.
Okay. I mean, following up to that, because we're talking about income groups, we're talking about economic
M40,
disparities and M40. So there's a question about, we have seen taxes for small businesses been reduced, and there are also tax cuts for M40. But how can tax policy tools accelerate economic recovery in detail, I suppose? Like, we present all these taxes and incentives, but sometimes people don't necessarily understand how the mechanics work.
Agree.
Earlier, when you talked about raising the income wages, and you actually briefly explained like how employer and employees cut. Maybe in the taxes for this, like reducing. Tax cuts for M40. Like, how can it actually accelerate economic recovery here? I mean, reducing tax. Also,
it's actually a question. It's question of balancing things, and I think in the budget speech, if I recall the figures correctly, they're talking about for the reduction of the M40 tax is for the band rate of 35,000 to 100,000. It's a 2% reduction, and this is going to cost. And then there is increase of 0.5% to 2%. For the taxpayers that are in the band of 100,000 to 1 million chargeable income. The overall effect of this is a reduction of tax revenues of about 900 million, if I got it correctly. So there is a reduction of revenues, but it's giving disposable income to the consumers. And it's about economic activity, it's about money changing hands and to spur the economic activity, etc. It's long-term wise, I believe we have to manage. Right now, the idea of giving a reduction of tax is to help the man in the street, the Rayant, to have a bit more disposable income to manage the rising cost of living. In the long term, if you're looking at reduction of taxes further, certain other taxes will have to come in. And there is therefore quite a big, I suppose, initiative or push or persuasion by various parties to look at carbon tax very seriously, right? Because, but that can only happen at that point in time, I suppose, when the cost of additional cost of goods and services which will come by way of carbon tax being imposed and the cost being handed down to the consumers, that can be managed by the levels of income that have been that have risen. So carbon tax is sort of a buzzword, but the implementation of it needs to be formulated, needs to be looked at very, very carefully.
Right.
Yeah, I want to add, okay. So basically, this is all controlling the amount of money in circulation. This is all demand side. You control the interest rate, you control fiscal policy, you control taxation and all that. This is short term. You have a headache, I give you Panadol, you feel better. But in the long run, you should be looking at the supply side. The supply side means improving our productivity and all that. Our productivity has been stagnating. You see, and this also ties with the minimum wages. Sorry, not with the low wages. See, what happened with low wages is that talented talented Malaysians go outside the country, and we will attract a lot of unskilled foreign labor, and that further depresses our wages. So you don't become competitive by becoming a low-cost manufacturing center. You become competitive by becoming innovative. Like the South Koreans, they can manufacture phones, TVs, and all of that. So that is what we should be looking at. This calls for the change in the structure of the economy. Every year, 300,000 graduates come out. Before COVID, only 100,000 got employed. After COVID, it's probably 60 to 70. So you have unemployed graduates. Unemployment is low, nice, but unemployment among youth is very high. 3 times more, and among the youth is the highest among the graduates. So these are the things that we should be looking at, not giving Panadol, you cut this, you cut that. You're not going to solve the problem. You've got to tackle the bull by the horns.
There has to be a long-term plan. There's this stopgap measure at the moment, which is to manage
That's how I see it.
And talking about graduates and all that, I think another important area, which is also I think covered in the budget, is the education. And the allocation for education sector, I think, is pretty high.
Right.
If not the highest, right?
Yes, the highest allocation.
But they've also been getting a lot of all this, I would say, like maybe not the highest, but high amount of allocation just to manage whatever initiatives that they have. But it seems, at least on the surface level, our education system seems to be like not. It's like they don't know what they are reaching towards, moving
where
towards.
we are heading and what we are, what we have achieved and where we are. Actually, I had an article that I contributed to the Star, I think just last week, where I mentioned that our education levels, with due respect, have actually gone far below. We were lagging behind Singapore. Right, a 12-year-old Singapore student, we talk about specific subjects like mathematics and science, their understanding or the syllabus that they're looking at is that of a 15-year-old in Malaysia. So we're actually lagging by 3 years by comparison in that sense. So I think there is quite a bit that needs to be perhaps overhauled, looked at, managed better from the education perspective. And so it's now a question of how these funds are utilized and managed and put to the best use that they can be. Yeah.
So beside this education ministry, what are other ministry that you think the budget should be allocated more?
Well, I think that is a question that is tailor-made for some.
Yeah.
Mr. Samirul, maybe you could answer
Good
that.
question. Education. Yeah. So basically, we all. That's the thing. What do we want to become? Yeah. The government says we want to become a high-income economy. Yeah.
Even
Okay.
55.2 billion.
Okay, so now this is the good question. Yeah. What is a developed country? There's no answer. Seriously, okay? So we have become an upper middle economy since 92. For 30 years, we are trapped there. Upper middle income economy that did not become a high income economy. But do you so what is a high income economy? You just have to pass a certain threshold. That is according to the World Bank.
Yeah,
Okay.
according to the World
Right.
Bank.
There's another thing called a Human Development Index.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, what does Human Development Index look at? Education.
Education.
And of course you get a lot health, because the education and health are two important things. And what was the other one? Financial position. Of course, that's what we talk about. So we are probably ranking around 60 out of 190 countries. And there's another one called emerging economies. Development. So we are an emerging economy. This is literature used by IMF. Now there's another famous one, first world, third world, and all that. This one comes from the Cold War era. So during that time, the first world country were the Western democracies. The second world country were the Soviet and their bloc, that communist countries. The third world were countries like us. So that is how we got that literature. Third world, first world. So you can't use that anymore.
Yeah.
It's not being used anymore. That's first world. So what we use is emerging economies or high income economy. But that's the thing, yeah. You see, you can become a high income economy, but with very low human development index. You're an oil-rich country, but your population is not healthy and they are illiterate. Possible.
Yes, yes.
But you can also have a very high human development index, like South Korea, and usually you will have a high income economy.
Yes.
But Greece is a particularly interesting case. It has a high human development index. It is a high income economy, and yet it got into a lot of trouble. Structure of the economy. So these are the things. So definitely education and health. But you also have to look at the outcomes. Doing a policy without evidence base is gamble. So you have to look at evidence based policy. You have to look at the outcomes. Did I answer your question?
I mean, somewhat.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
we all love the history and all these references that you're giving, because I mean, you know, sociopolitics affects you know, whatever we
economic
doing.
thinking and all that. Yeah.
You know, in Bhutan they have this thing called Gross Happiness Index, which probably should be introduced in Malaysia as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me,
Do you think so?
yeah.
Well, it will probably cause some rethinking about you know, whether we should be happy and whether we are happy.
Yes,
But
why not?
happiness
become
is
happy?
subjective. I don't think that can be implemented.
We are at the threshold of becoming a high income, and it has remained there for a long time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think the current rate
Maybe we
is
should pivot, right?
is 13,000 plus US,
Yeah.
probably close to 11. We just take one more step. But what do you want to? You know, I'm afraid that we will become a high-income economy, but with 60 or 70% B70, they're all dependent on government aid.
Right.
It is possible, and I call that a statistical mirage.
Okay.
Sure.
Talking about this education and everything, we have seen in the budget that the government have to allocate 50,000, if I'm not mistaken, laptop to the students and everything. So beside this measure and beside this thing, what do you think is the best way to help students?
Well, actually, the point that I suppose needs to be made is it's a question of how you want to take our education system from where it is today to where it will help you achieve some of those aspirations that we have. And whether it's by design or just by trial and error that we've come to where we are, that is something that needs to be thought about. So I think it's a question of really, I don't actually have the details on how those funds are going to be used, but it would be best to think about how to improve the teaching methods, how to improve the skills of the teachers, right, training, right, to become a better in terms of the value added that our teachers give to the students, how to raise that, how to get them to have you know, a wide, better understanding of the general issues that are there. Language, right, how at one time perhaps we were masters at the English language, and we ruled the fact that we are no longer there. So I think there are a lot of areas in which this, as far as implementation, as far as usage of the funds, can be strategically thought out and put to good use. And I believe, I'm sure, you know, the government has that in mind as well.
Right. I suppose last words from you, Samirul.
Yeah, this initiative of giving, I think they do that in India too. And India is a country which I like to study because they don't spend that much money as we do on education, yet they produce superb graduates. If you see, a lot of the tech leaders in the US are from All India Institute of Technology. Yeah, there are at least 5 or 6 of them, and they did courses at all of them, Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella and all that. There's something about how it is taught there, and how they are using tablets too. So something that we should look at. They are low cost, but they produce superb results. Of course, another country that you should be looking at is Singapore too, among others.
I mean, we all know.
I think before we wrap up, maybe I think some of our audience would like to know something about this Payung Rahmah concept, right?
Right.
Our PM has, you know, put this as a big new concept. So, do you think this will be a new form of economic model? So, what do you think about it?
What I've gathered, very, you know, at very high level from reading the budget speech today. This one of those initiatives under this Payung Rahmah is that Project Rahmah or something, right? Where they talk about basically it's to me that looks like a targeted subsidy where you have goods that you could purchase at 5 ringgit or at a certain price, and then the discounted discount by 30%, and in tandem with that, some of the other initiatives that have been put in. Well, it is, if you know, as far as an economic model is concerned, it is still essentially the government subsidizing part of the cost of goods and services for the taxpayers. And
Samirul, I mean, this Payung Rahmah is like an idea, right?
So it's good because basically you're taking care of those who are susceptible and vulnerable. That will probably be the B60 and 70. And I also hope they will widen the social safety net. There's about 1 or 2 million workers who are not covered in anything. So they, well, I can't remember what the term they use for this. But basically, all these people should be given EPF, I'm sorry, KW, SOCSO protection and all that. So it's basically widening the social net. If you want to become a caring society, you have to have this, you have to look after those who are vulnerable and susceptible, and also widen the social safety net.
I mean, level the playing field and try to at least look at whatever loopholes from the past budget has. I suppose when Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim launched, you know, the Malaysia Mandani logo and slogan, I mean, it's aimed at leading the country forward, right? Whether or not the budget would reflect that, it's, you know, we have to wait the next year for it to perform. Anyway, unfortunately, we have come to the end of the show. I suppose if we were to kind of look into the budget, we will, you know, sit here until tomorrow. Right?
Tomorrow morning.
But of course, to our audience, if you do have some, you know, thoughts on the budget itself that you would like to share, come on, share it across on our Facebook, sorry.
YouTube, Instagram. You can reach out to our official
Facebook accounts, NST Online. My name is Amalina Kamal.
I'm Azanis Shahila Aman.
And thank you. This is the NST Insight Post-Budget Analysis.
We'll see you guys again in the next budget.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In the next episode.
Yeah.
Thank you.